places in the world where the dead are supposed to rest peacefully, where silence settles over the ground like a final promise. But sometimes, that promise is broken, because throughout history, there have been graves that refuse to stay closed, coffins found above the ground without explanation, burial sites reopening overnight, bodies discovered in positions no dead person should ever be able to make. And what makes these cases terrifying is that many of them were officially documented. Tonight, we're looking at real graves that seem to reject the idea of staying buried. And by the end of this video, you might never look at a cemetery the same way again. In 1817, a small island in Barbados became the center of one of the strangest burial mysteries ever recorded. It started inside a stone burial vault belonging to the Chase family. The vault was built from solid coral stone, heavy enough that several men were required just to move the entrance slab. There were no secret tunnels. No cracks large enough for a person to enter. At first, nothing seemed unusual. But then the family opened the vault for another burial, and what they found inside made people step back in horror. The coffins had moved, not slightly, not naturally. They were violently scattered across the chamber. One coffin weighing hundreds of pounds had somehow been thrown against a wall. Another stood upright. The family assumed grave robbers had broken in somehow, but nothing had been stolen. The vault was sealed again. Months later, another funeral took place. When workers removed the massive stone entrance, the coffins had moved again. This time, people panicked, because the floor inside the vault was covered in fine sand, specifically designed to catch footprints. There were none. No signs of intrusion. No marks. Nothing. Yet the dead had somehow changed positions again. News spread across the island quickly. People began whispering that something inside the vault did not want to stay buried. Some believed it was caused by flooding or underground gases. But investigators found no evidence supporting either explanation. Eventually, authorities completely emptied the vault. And to this day, nobody can fully explain how those coffins kept moving inside a sealed stone chamber. But that was only the beginning. In the 1930s, a cemetery caretaker in rural England reported something disturbing during his night rounds. Several graves appeared slightly opened. At first, he blamed erosion from heavy rain. But one grave caught his attention. The soil above it looked disturbed from the inside, not dug outward by animals, pushed upward. When workers inspected the coffin days later, they found the lid cracked open internally, and the body inside was no longer lying flat. The corpse had shifted upward toward the broken section. Now, there is a medical explanation for some post-mortem movement. As bodies decompose, gases can build pressure inside the coffin. Muscles may contract. Limbs can move slightly. But this case disturbed investigators for one specific reason. The position of the body suggested force, enough force to split wood from the inside. People immediately began discussing an old fear humanity has carried for centuries. The fear of being buried alive. In the 18th and 19th centuries, this fear became so common that some people requested special safety coffins. These coffins contained bells, breathing tubes, or flags attached to strings tied around the buried person's hand. If they woke underground, they could signal for help. And horrifyingly, there are documents. Entertaining cases suggesting this fear wasn't completely irrational. One German medical journal from the early 1800s described a woman declared dead after falling into a fever-induced coma. Days later, strange sounds were reportedly heard near her grave. When the coffin was opened, scratches covered the inside lid. Her fingers were bloodied, and her body had turned sideways. Imagine that for a moment. Waking up underground in complete darkness, unable to breathe properly, knowing nobody can hear you. Psychologists say the fear of premature burial is one of the deepest human anxieties because it combines helplessness, claustrophobia, and isolation all at once. And maybe that's why stories about disturbed graves affect people so deeply. Because somewhere in the back of our minds, we wonder if some of these graves were never supposed to be sealed. But not every case has a scientific explanation. In 1988, workers at a cemetery in South America reported repeated disturbances at a child's grave. Flowers left on the site were found scattered every morning. The soil appeared loose, despite no signs of weather damage. Then one night, security guards decided to monitor the area directly, around 2 a.m. One guard claimed he heard faint knocking sounds coming from underground. At first, he ignored it. Then it happened again, 3 slow knocks. He reportedly became so frightened that he refused to approach the grave. The next morning, workers discovered the ground above the coffin had partially collapsed inward. No evidence of vandalism was ever found. Local newspapers dismissed it as panic and superstition. But years later, former cemetery staff still refused to discuss the incident publicly. And strangely, several workers quit within the same month. Now, maybe there was a rational explanation hidden somewhere in that story. Fear can distort memory. Darkness changes perception. Once people expect something horrifying, the brain begins connecting ordinary events into terrifying patterns. Sometimes, even logic starts to feel weak, especially when multiple witnesses report the same thing. In New Orleans, one of America's oldest cities, there are above-ground tombs designed to protect bodies from flooding. Tourists visit them every year, but one tomb became infamous after repeated reports that its sealed door would appear slightly open at night. Visitors claimed they saw candles burning inside despite nobody entering the crypt. Some witnesses even described hearing whispers nearby. Paranormal investigators later examined the site. Most found nothing unusual, except for one detail. Temperature readings around the tomb reportedly dropped suddenly without explanation. Skeptics argued it was simply environmental variation. Believers saw it differently, because according to local legend, the person buried there had been obsessed with avoiding death, and some residents believed they never truly accepted burial. There's something psychologically disturbing about graves reopening. A grave represents certainty, finality. The moment humans tell themselves a story is over, when that certainty breaks, even slightly, fear replaces reason very quickly. And historically, humans have always connected disturbed graves with curses, hauntings, or unfinished business. Ancient cultures sealed tombs with heavy stones not only to stop animals, but also to symbolically trap spirits. Some medieval graves even contained iron cages placed over coffins, not to keep people out, but to keep something in. And then there are the modern cases with cameras, police reports, witnesses, statements. In 2013, cemetery workers in Eastern Europe noticed one grave repeatedly sinking and reopening, despite multiple repairs. Each time the ground was restored, it collapsed again within days. Engineers inspected the site for structural problems. Nothing unusual was found beneath it. One worker later claimed he refused to continue repairing the grave after hearing noises below, while working alone early in the morning. Authorities eventually sealed the area permanently. No official paranormal explanation was given, but locals still avoid that section of the cemetery after dark. And maybe that's what makes these stories linger for so long. Not because they prove the supernatural exists, but because they sit in that uncomfortable space between explanation and uncertainty. Humans need answers. We need causes. But some cases leave behind only questions. Questions that slowly grow more disturbing the longer you think about them. Like this one. In the late 1800s, a family in France buried their elderly relative after what doctors believed was a sudden illness. Weeks later, grave robbers attempting to steal jewelry reportedly opened the coffin. But when we looked inside, they fled. The body had turned completely over, its face pressed against the coffin floor, its fingers bent unnaturally. Police later suggested decomposition, and shifting movement caused the position change. But newspapers at the time spread a darker theory, that the person had awakened after burial and tried desperately to escape. Whether true or not, stories like these spread across Europe rapidly. People became terrified of burial. Some delayed funerals for days. Others demanded repeated heartbeat checks before coffins were sealed, because once that lid closes, there is no second chance. Even today, disturbed graves continue appearing in headlines. Most eventually receive practical explanations. Flooding, soil collapse, animal interference, human vandalism. But every once in a while, a case appears where the evidence doesn't fully fit. And those are the stories people remember, not because they're proven, but because they feel possible enough to haunt you afterward. Maybe that's why graveyard fears never disappear. Deep down, cemeteries force people to confront something uncomfortable. The fact that death is supposed to stay still, silent, controlled. And when something buried begins to move, even slightly, it breaks a rule our minds depend on. So tonight, before you sleep, imagine standing alone in a cemetery after midnight. Cold wind moving through rows of graves. Everything silent until somewhere in the darkness, you hear 3 slow knocks beneath the ground. And suddenly, the idea of rest in peace no longer feels guaranteed.